Hi, everybody. Welcome to IAB There, our regular streaming show where we connect the digital advertising ecosystem. I'm Brad Behrens, editor-in-chief here at the IAB. We founded this show in the early days of the pandemic in order to connect people because we were suddenly all working out of our homes, wondering what was going to be happening in the world around us. Things have gotten better. We seem to be recovering. There's still a lot of turbulence out there, though. And so we're continuing this show to help people navigate a time when more is changing than at any other time in the last century. However, for people who work in digital advertising, things have continued to be changing for the entire time that we have had digital advertising. This episode is part of a series celebrating IAB's 25th anniversary. And this time, we're excited to bring Rich Lafergie, who was the founding chair of the IAB. He is the general partner for Archer Advisors and the director of the Forays Institute of Advanced Advertising Studies. Rich is the person who has been involved intimately with the IAB for the longest time, and he has been my partner in this series. I'm also delighted to bring David Moore. He is the CEO and founder of Brightpool. David and Bob Perkins from Brightpool were our guests at IAB There about a year ago in June of 2020, at that time talking about navigating the crisis we were in and how it compared to earlier crises. Dave was the chair of IAB from 2009 until 2011. So we're jumping in medias res, into the middle of things with this episode to talk about what it was like during his tenure as the chair. He also was the first chair of IAB Tech Lab. We'll ask him about that. We'll ask him about his career, about what IAB was up to at the time. And then at the end, we're going to take a look forward to the next 25 years of the Interactive Advertising Bureau and the interactive advertising industry. So let's bring them into the stream. Rich Lafergie, David Moore, welcome to IAB There.
Great to be here.
Thanks, Brad.
Welcome back, guys. So, Dave, you started in television. You started at Turner in 1979. So you had, a pretty substantial TV career before you came to digital. I'd love to know more about sort of the early days, and also, and I saw this in your bio, what the heck was Lifetime Medical TV?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. I started in the traditional television advertising business. So I was selling ads on regular TV stations on a local basis. And I'd always been interested in being in on the ground floor of a new medium. And that's when I went to Turner. And at that point in time, he just reached about 15% of the country, which qualified for Nielsen ratings. He had yet to launch CNN. And I worked there for about 2.5 years. Got recruited to go to a network called Cable Health Network, which ultimately merged with another service that was owned by Hearst and ABC, whereas Cable Health was owned by Viacom, and we merged to create Lifetime Television in April of 1984. Because I had started at Cable Health Network, we pursued all the healthcare advertisers. I mean, they were a natural endemic group that would benefit from advertising on a service whose primary purpose was to provide health and science information to consumers and professionals alike. And we ran into a number of companies, pharmaceutical companies, that only made prescription drugs, and their target audience was physicians. So they said, if you had something for physicians, we'd really be interested. So we went back to the office, consulted with a couple of the doctors that were part of the Cable Health Network that were now still part of Lifetime. And we wrote up a treatment for a program called Physicians Journal Update, which was a weekly show that would keep doctors abreast of all the important articles and medical information and
So
journals.
today, Lifetime is television for women, but this was an offshoot that was
This was
programming for
beforehand.
doctors.
Yes, beforehand. So this is in 1984. So we launched Physicians Journal Update. We sold about $3.5 million of advertising in it upfront from prescription drug companies. We charged a CPM of $1,000 a thousand, and we charged $1 per doctor. And in the fledgling days of cable television where nobody was making any money, Lifetime Medical Television was the driving profit maker for Lifetime Television. Now, I ran that service for about 8 years, and it gave me operating experience in managing a P&L. And we knew it was only a matter of time before they took our programming off of Lifetime and substituted it with the other programming that they were running Monday through Sunday. You know, having a network for doctors, very small, ratings plummeted during that period of time. So at the time that it looked like they were going to pull our service, I did a management buyout of Lifetime Medical Television. And the idea was to use computers as a distribution source. So I had all the programming, I had staff, and went out and started pitching pharmaceutical companies on a computer-based service on which we could put a lot of the programming that I'd purchased or got in Lifetime Medical Television through management buyout. And sold about $7 million of upfront commitments to pharmaceutical companies to participate in this computer delivered service. This is 1993. I got them to give me 25% of the contract value upfront upon signature of the contract. So that funded the company. And we were on our way to launching this, exciting interactive service via computers using CompuServe as a backbone for delivering text information. And I needed to raise some more money. Ended up talking to Reuters, and I ended up selling the company to Reuters for $10 million in 1994. And so I went out and looked for something else to do, and the CEO of Lifetime had gone out and bought Petrie Television, which was a television rep company. And so
for those of you,
hey,
people who don't know, what's a rep company and what was a television rep company.
Sure. So essentially, television rep represents a television's inventory in all markets except their home market. So for instance, Petrie Television, Cox, Katz Communications is still around. If they represent a station in Des Moines, Iowa, that station sells all the advertising they can in the Des Moines, Iowa marketplace. Petrie would sell it outside of all those marketplaces in major cities throughout the country. Normally each rep had about 15 different cities. There, New York, Chicago, LA, Detroit, Minneapolis, St. Louis, Dallas, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was hired to get Petrie into new businesses and leverage their core competencies. And so when I got there in 95, when Windows 95 was launching, and there was a lot of press about this, it was a big deal. MSN was launching as part of that. So I went in and I said, hey, look, why don't we start representing websites? And he says, well, that's a pretty good idea. Why don't you try to get that going? So we got a handful of websites. Woman's Wire, if you remember that, with Marlene McDaniels, and we had not InfoSpace, maybe it was InfoSpace and some others. Now, we got the business. However, we didn't have broadband connection. We didn't even have a dial-up. The only way that we could figure out and take a look at the website and where the inventory was to unplug the fax machine and plug in our laptop to take a look at what was going on the internet. It was all dial-up in those days. There were no ad servers. And so we essentially launched that business in the end of 1995. And before too long, it was pretty obvious to me that representing individual websites was not a good business. Thought it would make sense to network those together. That we did. And we used a company called AdForce, which was an ad serving solution to help us do that. And in the middle of 1997, DoubleClick raised about $40 million in venture capital. I went into the owner of Petrie and I said, hey, we got to stop bootstrapping this thing. This is a real opportunity. He said, love to help you, but I don't have any money. So I thought about it, went back and offered to do a management buyout of what was then Petrie Interactive. And I did that in October of 1997. I had about 3 months to go out and raise money. Ended up raising $10 million and found 2 other companies to merge with, one of which was Cats, who had an interactive version as well. And then there was another Silicon Alley company called Interactive Imaginations, which was the founder of the Riddler and a network called the Commonwealth Network. Merged them together, launched 24/7 Media at the beginning of 1998. It's a lot of information. I hope that was interesting.
No, it was fascinating. Rich, you had something you wanted to ask.
Well, I think it's absolutely fascinating the arc that you've had from even before the internet started with Lifetime. And what strikes me as you have never been afraid of trying something new, right? And really kind of trying something really unconventional, like doing management buyouts, kind of like if you saw something that wasn't working, you said, well, let me run it, and you kind of take it away from the ownership. So I'm just curious, like, what has been your North Star as you've looked at all this, you know, in terms of innovation? Like, you've been a pioneer from before the internet, and a bunch of different people were pioneers after the internet. Like, what's been your North Star, and that kind of makes you tick?
I think I was born with it. I'm not really happy with the status quo most of the time. And so when I'm unhappy with it, I tend to take things into my own hands and try to change it. And, you know, it hasn't always worked. You're hearing about some of the successes right now, but for the most part, I really enjoy startups. It's the energy and the excitement of them. The highs are high, the lows are low. And I've found it to be very intellectually stimulating, and I think it keeps you young. And as Rich and I both know, we have the same philosophy that a sound body and sound mind can lead to great longevity unless you get hit by a truck.
Exactly.
Yeah. So don't play in traffic and keep on bodybuilding. Let's jump into your time as chair at the IAB. And you've been involved with the IAB since 2001. So you'd already been a part of things for a good 8 years. 2009, as we learned earlier, was a couple of years after you'd sold 24/7 Real Media to WPP. 2009 was also when, like now, we were just starting to look prairie dog up and see, the light at the end of the tunnel, to see the dawn after a global financial collapse that was still, things were still dire. And people, to this day, some people are still feeling those effects. But what was the IAB like at that time? What were the big challenges that were happening? I'd been in the industry for about 5 years then. What were you seeing, both of you? Let's start with David. What were you seeing in the industry as the big challenges then?
I love the visual of prairie dog up. I haven't heard that before. Well, I'd seen Rich started as the chairman of the IB. I think after him was a lady by the name of Robin Webster for a brief period of time. And we had Greg Stewart, and we had hired Randall Rothenberg. And at the time that I assumed the chairmanship, I was in line for it, but Wenda Millard was the chairman. And halfway through her term, she left to go to MediaLink. And as a result, there was a gap there. So I jumped in 6 months earlier than I normally would have done. and then carried out the term for a year and a half. This was a time where I think the New York Times did an investigative report where they went into people's homes and asked for permission to look at their computers, and then would talk to the consumers about how many different cookies were on the computers. And it was a big expose, if you will, for the industry overall, because cookies were perceived as being placed covertly on the computer. People didn't know what they were for. They had no idea they were even on there, so that when the Times talked to them about how many cookies they had on their computer from all these different companies, they were shocked. And so it was a big deal. And there was, I think that was about the time when the IAB and the 4As and the ANA started having one joint meeting a year, which was a very productive activity overall. And I remember being at a meeting where, how do we educate people about cookies and why they're actually good for the business overall? Because when they're placed in a manner surreptitiously, so to speak, it created a lot of distrust overall. So the conversation started evolving to, well, what is the quid pro quo for free content, right? These companies are not in this for philanthropic purposes. How do they get their money back to pay for this great content that you enjoy? And if you're a consumer, and this is back in 2009, and some of the same rationale still applies today. If you're a consumer, you're getting this free content, you're not letting us target you with advertising, then we should not let you on the site, or you can pay for the content. So that quid pro quo argument was going on for, continues to go on in probably a little different fashion today. But that was really the point in time that I remember. And there was a tradition that when the new chairman comes into the IAB, they always give a speech at the annual meeting. And as I think about it, that was the essence of my speech, was giving consumers a fair exchange of value for their attention to advertising.
We still, I think, have a lot of work to do in terms of conveying that message. The sort of patois in 2021 is consumer value exchange, but I think that many people consider it to be a data tax or a privacy tax, and it's hard for us to convey that there is value that is being exchanged. Rich, do you want to layer on anything onto what Dave just said?
Yeah, I think it absolutely was the first time that we had to confront the value exchange with consumers, and consumers happily took the content for free, but didn't know about the cookies. And we just implicitly thought that we had permission to do that because we could. And it's nothing nefarious. It's nothing that we were trying to do, get one over on the consumer, but it was simply a tracking and a measurement approach. And it kind of, when the New York Times piece hit, what really, I think, got a lot of attention was the sheer volume of all these cookies, because they were not interoperable. There was no unified cookie, although at the IAB, we talked about that in the predecessor to the Tech Lab, about a universal cookie, about specific fields that you could put information in. So we had tried to deal with that, but we thought wrestling our arms around a universal cookie was probably going to be too much and too much heavy lifting. So we just couldn't get that done. But it was the first time that, consumers said that this was an issue. Now, when you look back upon then, people complained about it, but really didn't do anything about it. I think we're at a different point in time. Just because people have that much more seasoning, and we'll talk a little bit later about where this is going, because it started back then in a very benign way, but it has, I think, come back to bite us.
Well, I also think that, Apple taking unilateral action, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, to pivot from an opt-out model with apps on iOS to an opt-in model. And what we're seeing is, data that suggests that anywhere from 80 to 97% of iOS users are opting out. They're choosing not to be tracked. So, making it easier for people to make the choice has led them to make the choice, which I think then puts additional pressure on this industry to explain the value proposition that we're talking about. But you mentioned Tech Lab. And Dave, you were the first chair of Tech Labs, that's about 7 years ago. What brought you to taking that headache on? As my friends at Tech Lab are, I'm sure, quite grateful for it. But what was your motive in joining, and how do you think Tech Lab has matured over the course of those 7 years?
Well, I remember Randall Rothenberg approached me to do it, and the rationale, I think, was that, I'd been on the executive committee. I was treasurer, I was secretary. I'd done quite a few different jobs at the IAB over the course of the time I've been involved. And so it was going to require fundraising. We needed to go out and get anchor companies to pony up $300,000 to get the Tech Lab up and rolling. And so it sounded like a great idea to me. And as we all know, it was. And so we started out, and I helped raise the money to get the organization started through companies like AppNexus and Tremor. Google was in there as well. Sorry for the other three that slipped my mind right now, but we got it up and running. And then we hired our first CEO of the Tech Lab, who, I don't know, he lasted maybe about a year. And then we hired another one, and she lasted about a year. And then we hired Dennis Buckheim, who was in the IB at the time handling data, and he moved into the job, and the whole organization accelerated nicely under his tutelage. And of course, now we've just hired a new CEO for the IB Tech Lab that I think everybody is very excited about.
But we have not yet released that person's name, so we'll keep that mum for now, but you can find the press release on iab.com when it happens. So let's, David, I think what's fascinating is, here you've been, at the start of cable television, at the start of interactive advertising. So sort of a two-pronged question, but the first is, let's start to look forward, which is, what do you think and we'll get to Brightpool in a moment, but what are the big challenges facing the industry and the IAB as we look into the next 25 years? And is there a new medium that has caught your eye? From TV to the internet, like, what is the next? Another way of thinking about this is, as an entrepreneur and someone who's jumped in to new media, serially, what do you think the next big reservoir of human attention and activity is going to be after the phone, or built on top of the phone? But help us to see around corners. What's next?
Well, if you look at just what's happened with connected TV and OTT, how that has just literally exploded over the last couple years. I think the pandemic accelerated the adoption of it. But looking at 25 years, of course, I hope I'm around to see if this prediction is true, but everything is converging now. You still have quite a few paper publications, whether it's newspapers, magazines, other types of written material. And I just see a day where there's nothing, really no paper anymore at all. And that all media, coalesces into a digital presentation. And what that means for media in general is that a lot of it is going to continue to be bought programmatically. Automation will probably increase. Programmatic will increase. It'll never be 100% of the entire marketplace. But because everything was going to be tracked digitally, attribution, realistic reach and frequencies across all media is going to be easy to do. And the marketplace will end up with a lot of quant analysts that are similar to the ones you've had in the financial business, where you can do a return on investment projection based on a certain expenditure that's trackable, measurable, and predictable overall. So I think that's going to be a really big deal, but it'll happen over time, because as I learned, even with cable television, I mean, Ted Turner was saying in 1980, the networks are going to be out of business. Well, you know, or 1990, whatever the number was, they're still in business. And while the business may not be as vibrant as it was before, a lot of it is being supplemented by the OTT and CTV services that they've launched. Now, tandem to that is something Rich pointed out earlier. That is, we're wrestling with the same problems with the consumer, how their data is used, whether it's collected in a honest and forthright manner. Ethically sourced data is the new buzz term that we use at Brightpool and other identity services, because the consumer is ultimately the one in charge of their data. And so there's a paradigm shift that's happening right now, which is taking what we used to think was, how do we use data to, you know, reach the consumer in the best possible way in terms of advertising, to how can we use a consumer's data to give them what they want? And I think that paradigm shift is an important one that's going on right now. And through that, government regulation that's not far behind is going to put the consumer in charge. And I think that's a point of view that we need to adopt as an industry, and offers great opportunities for all of us going forward.
So, you know, I totally agree with you, Dave, in that I think convergence is what is happening. I think streaming is an early indicator of how attention is shifting. And as you look at it, if you apply the prime model to advertising, where your relationship with a retailer or a telephone company, or you name it, actually earns you services and media and content for your attention, I think a lot of stuff is going to be subsidized. A lot of the content that we see is going to be subsidized by our relationships with our retailers or telecom companies. And that's going to be enabled by this connected attribution, so you can go cross-platform. So there's going to be this nice ecosystem where media is kind of transparent from device to device. All your subscriptions are going to be rationalized. They're going to be paid for. Your phone is going to be paid for. I don't know if your car is going to be paid for, but you know, I mean, think about celebrity sponsor, you know, celebrities getting certain cars. I mean, that's sponsorship right there. So I think all this is going to happen. And yet at the same time, we do have this reset and reckoning kind of self-imposed with its sunsetting of cookies, with Apple, as well as the regulations that are coming down the road. I do think it's going to be a reset, because as I think there's a chance that things are going to have some overreach, and things are going to become, people are going to opt out of stuff. They're not going to be authenticated when they're going to look at media, so we're not going to know who they are. And I think there just isn't going to be enough reach to reach individual people. So we're going to have to figure something out in this value equation so that consumers can participate. And I think browsers like Brave, which are paying people to actually for their attention, other sorts of models. I've been a big fan of this model. I was on the board of All Advantage, which paid people to look at banners, and there was a lot of things broken with that company, one of the biggest creators ever. But I think at the end of the day, the consumer hasn't participated in any media value that they've created. And so I think that is going to be a big reset. And that's going to be, we're going to have to do that, because as people opt out of being tracked and getting measured, we're going to have to offer them something, so they're going to want to do that. And that's got to get figured out.
Yeah.
So
Well,
let me end with two questions. Dave, for the people who don't know, you mentioned ethically sourced data. Just give us what's the elevator pitch on Brightpool? What is it and why did you start it?
it was established to create a technology to replace third-party cookies. It had become ubiquitous and duplicative for consumers. Average consumer has between 75 and 150 cookies that are them. And as a result, reach and frequency is really difficult to do accurately, let alone attribution. So we started the company to replace those cookies with our technology. And it's been a very interesting 2.5 years, with Google continuing to postpone the ultimate deprecation, but the end is near.
And I think it's worth pointing out that you started the company before Google announced the deprecation of third-party cookies, which was in January of 2020. Rich, last question to you. As we're ending this series, or at least this episode in this series, cast your mind forward. We know that IAB and the industry have been concerned with a lot of the same issues for 25 years, and we're continuing to ever iterate and ever improve. What's your hope for the near and far-flung future of the IAB as this industry continues to mature and continues to dominate more and more of advertising?
Well, my hope is that as an industry, we get the consumer value equation right. And, just to circle back to that, and I think the IAB can be, that can be something that we could add into the equation, because we're very good at being a big tent and having all of the sell side. We've added in part of the buy side with brands, and we have some great relationships with agencies. So I think we have a great foundation for moving forward. I think there's a place for the consumer's voice, and we do that with research, but maybe there's other ways that we can incorporate where the association goes. And my hope is that this seamless kind of movement between media properties and brands and value equation, I hope that this technology reset that we're going through right now really gives us the foundation. I don't think we're going to get there in the next 5 or 10 years. I think it might take 25 years to get to that level of consumer value equation. And one of the other things we haven't really mentioned is control, because that's been part of what has been missing. It has been the consumer's ability to control, what data marketers are using. And I think that's part of, that's one of the issues that's raised, but we haven't really figured out a nice way to do that at scale.
Well, I think that's a fabulous answer. And I want to thank both of you individually and collectively for your service to the industry and to the IAB, because the IAB could not do the work that it does without just an extraordinary number of people leaning in and agreeing that we're all in this together. So thank you both, and thank you for joining me today on IAB There.